the sleigh ride Sabotage. Welcome back to Mindful Musings, where mysteries unfold like morning mist over a frozen pond. I'm your host, William, and today we're settling into another cozy mystery from the world of Miss Marple. As the winter wind whistles outside, pour yourself something warm and join me in St. Mary Mead, where the season of giving has taken a decidedly dark turn. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Drop a comment below and let me know which corner of the world you're enjoying this tale from. Now, let's begin with the sleigh ride Sabotage. Chapter 1. The Bells of Christmas Eve. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 days when Miss Jane Marple made her way carefully along the high street of St. Mary Mead, her sensible boots crunching on the fresh powder. The village looked particularly charming dressed in white, with holly wreaths adorning every door and golden lights spilling from frosted windows. Yet Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes noticed details others might miss: the thin coat on old Mrs. Dawlish, the worried expression on the postman's face as he counted coins outside the bakery. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you!" The booming voice belonged to Thomas Barclay, a portly man of 50 with an impressive moustache and the self-satisfied air of someone who believed himself indispensable to village life. He stood beside a magnificent horse-drawn sleigh, its red paint gleaming against the snow, brass bells jingling merrily as the 2 chestnut horses stamped their feet. "Mr. Barclay," Miss Marple acknowledged with a slight nod, "your sleigh rides have become quite the tradition." "3rd year running," Barclay announced proudly, "and this year promises to be our most successful yet. The Warmth for Winter Fund will benefit tremendously. Every penny goes to helping our elderly residents heat their homes through these bitter months." Miss Marple observed how his eyes didn't quite meet hers when he said this, focusing instead on adjusting an already perfect bow on the sleigh's decoration. "How generous of you to organise such an event, Mr. Barclay. I trust the donations have been substantial." "Oh yes, quite substantial. We've raised more than ever before. The pensioners of St. Mary Mead won't suffer from the cold this winter, I can assure you." He pulled out a gold pocket watch with unnecessary flourish. "The evening rides begin at 6. I do hope you'll join us. 5 shillings per person, all for charity, naturally." "I wouldn't miss it," Miss Marple replied, though her tone carried a note of thoughtfulness that might have worried Mr. Barclay had he been paying attention. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple encountered Agnes Pemberton struggling with a heavy basket near the church. The elderly former nurse's face was drawn with cold, her lips tinged blue despite her attempts to smile. "Let me help you with that, Agnes," Miss Marple said, taking one handle of the basket. "Oh, you're very kind, Miss Marple. It's just some mending I've taken in. Every little helps, you know, especially with the heating bills." "But surely the Warmth for Winter Fund—" Agnes's expression tightened. "I applied, of course. Mr. Barclay said the funds were already allocated for this year. Perhaps next winter." She attempted a brave smile that didn't reach her eyes. By evening, the village green had transformed into a winter wonderland. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting warm pools of light on the gathered families. Children's laughter rang out as they waited their turn for the sleigh rides, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Miss Marple stood with Dr. Haydock, the village physician, watching as Barclay helped a young family into the sleigh with exaggerated gallantry. "Curious thing," Dr. Haydock murmured. "I've treated 3 cases of severe bronchitis among our elderly residents this month. All claim they couldn't afford adequate heating." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyes followed Barclay as he collected money from the next group of riders. "Yet Mr. Barclay assures us the fund is thriving." The final ride of the evening was scheduled for 8 o'clock. A group of well-dressed visitors from London climbed aboard, laughing and calling out Christmas greetings. Barclay himself took the reins, his face flushed with success and perhaps something stronger from the flask he'd been consulting throughout the evening. The horses set off at a gentle trot, bells jingling in the crisp night air. Then suddenly, everything went wrong. The horses' gentle trot became a wild gallop. Screams replaced laughter as the sleigh careened toward the frozen mill pond, and then, with a sickening crack, it overturned in a shower of snow and splintered wood. Chapter 2. Blood on fresh snow. The aftermath of the accident was chaos. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies as villagers rushed toward the overturned sleigh. Children were quickly shepherded away by their parents, though not before several had seen what no child should witness. Thomas Barclay's body lying twisted in the snow, dark stains spreading beneath him like spilled wine on a white tablecloth. Dr. Haydock was first to reach the scene, his medical bag appearing as if by magic. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her keen eyes taking in every detail, the scattered packages from the sleigh, the terrified horses being calmed by Robert Henley, the stable master, and the London visitors huddled together in shock, snow dusting their expensive coats. "Stand back, everyone," Dr. Haydock commanded, kneeling beside Barclay's motionless form. After a brief examination, he looked up gravely. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done. He's gone." Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, his perpetual expression of irritation even more pronounced than usual. He was not pleased to be called out on Christmas Eve, and his mood didn't improve when he spotted Miss Marple among the crowd. "I suppose you've already formed your theories," he said, sourly. "I merely observe, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though I did notice something curious about the way the horses bolted. In my experience with my nephew's horses, they rarely panic without cause." Slack grunted dismissively and turned to Dr. Haydock. "Cause of death?" "Trampling primarily. Multiple injuries consistent with being struck by hooves, but—" Haydock hesitated, glancing at Miss Marple. "The pattern of injuries suggests he was thrown from the sleigh with considerable force, more force than a simple overturn would typically generate." The stable master, Robert Henley, was examining the harness when he called out sharply, "Inspector, you need to see this." The leather straps that connected the horses to the sleigh showed clear evidence of tampering. Clean cuts, partially hidden by what appeared to be deliberate wear marks, ran 3/4 through the thick leather. "Someone wanted this to fail," Henley said grimly. "These cuts were made with a sharp blade, probably sometime in the last day or two. The remaining leather would hold under normal conditions, but any sudden stress—" "Like the horses bolting," Inspector Slack finished. "But what made them bolt in the first place?" Miss Marple bent carefully to examine something in the snow. "Inspector, there appear to be burns marks here on this piece of leather. And is that—" "Yes, I believe that's a spent firecracker." The implications were clear. Someone had deliberately frightened the horses with a firecracker, knowing the weakened harness would fail, sending Thomas Barclay to his death. As the body was removed and the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple noticed Agnes Pemberton standing alone, staring at the blood-stained snow. The elderly woman's expression was unreadable. "A terrible accident," Miss Marple said gently, approaching her. Agnes turned, her eyes hard as winter frost. "Accident? Perhaps, though some might say Mr. Barclay's been heading for a fall for quite some time." She pulled her thin coat tighter. "Did you know that Martha Hedges froze to death last January? Couldn't afford coal. She'd applied to the Warmth for Winter Fund 3 times. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "I hadn't heard. How dreadful." "Mr. Barclay said the fund had no money left. Strange, considering all these sleigh rides and donations." Agnes's voice carried a bitterness sharp as the winter wind. "Martha was my friend for 60 years. We trained as nurses together." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her cosy parlour, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the evening's events. The death of Thomas Barclay was no accident, that much was certain, but understanding why someone had wanted him dead would require delving into the supposed charity he'd run with such public enthusiasm. Her telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Mrs. Dawlish, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know. I saw someone in the stable. Last night, very late. They were carrying something. Tools, I think." "Did you recognize them?" "I couldn't be certain, but they walked with a slight limp. Military bearing despite it. Rather like old James Cartwright." Miss Marple thanked her and returned to her knitting, her mind working through the possibilities. James Cartwright, a respected veteran, devoted husband and skilled handyman who maintained much of the village's equipment, including, she recalled, the Christmas sleigh. Chapter 3. Ledgers and Lies. The morning after Barclay's death dawned crystal clear and brutally cold. Miss Marple wrapped herself in her warmest coat and made her way to the village hall, where Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters. She found him surrounded by boxes of papers, his face growing progressively redder as he examined them. "These records are a disgrace," he muttered, not bothering to look up as Miss Marple entered. Barclay kept the charity's books, if you can call them that, in complete disorder. Receipts mixed with personal correspondence, donation records on scattered scraps of paper. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "the disorder was intentional. In my experience, Inspector, those who wish to hide something often find chaos more useful than order." Slack snorted, but didn't disagree. "We've found enough to show that the Warmth for Winter Fund collected substantial donations, over £2,000 in the last 3 years, according to what we can piece together." "My goodness, that would have provided significant heating assistance to our elderly residents." "Would have, yes, if it had been distributed." Slack held up a ledger. According to the bank records, less than £400 was ever withdrawn from the charity account for distribution. The rest went into Barclay's personal account, marked as administrative costs and equipment maintenance. Miss Marple's needles, which she'd brought along and was working with absent-mindedly, paused. "Equipment maintenance? What equipment would a heating charity require?" "Exactly what I wondered." Slack's expression was grim. "Turns out Barclay used fund money to purchase those horses and that fancy sleigh. Told everyone they were rentals, charged premium prices for private rides throughout December, and pocketed every penny." A knock at the door interrupted them. Young Timothy Wells, the grocer's son, stood nervously in the doorway, cap in hand. "Inspector Miss Marple, my mum said I should tell you what I saw. About Mr. Cartwright." Slack leaned forward. "What about him, boy?" "I saw him coming out of the stable 2 nights ago. It was past midnight. I was coming back from carol practice, taking the long way round. He was carrying his leather-working tools." After Timothy left, Slack stood abruptly. "That's enough for me. Cartwright had means and opportunity. Now we just need motive." "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, "we might find that at his cottage." James Cartwright lived in a small, neat cottage on Church Lane with his wife, Mary. When they arrived, they found him in his workshop, carefully oiling a set of well-maintained cavalry tack. He looked up at their approach, his weathered face showing no surprise. "Inspector, Miss Marple, I've been expecting you." The cottage was cold, despite the small fire struggling in the grate. Mary Cartwright sat bundled in blankets, her face pale and drawn, a persistent cough rattling her chest. "Mr. Cartwright," Slack began, "we need to ask you about your whereabouts 2 nights ago." "I was in the stable," Cartwright replied simply, "working on the harness." "At midnight?" "I couldn't sleep." His jaw tightened. "Hadn't been able to sleep properly since Mary took ill, since we applied to Barclay's fund for help with heating and were told there was no money available." Miss Marple moved closer to Mary, noting the medicine bottles on the side table. "Pneumonia?" Mary nodded weakly. "The doctor says I need warmth to recover, but we can't afford—" She broke off in another coughing fit. Cartwright's hands clenched. "I served this country for 30 years. Mary worked as a seamstress until her eyes gave out. We're not asking for charity, just help from a fund specifically meant for people like us. But Barclay said the coffers were empty." "So you decided to investigate," Miss Marple said. "I knew something wasn't right. All those donations, all that money coming in from the sleigh rides. Where was it going?" I started asking questions quietly. Found out about Martha Hedges, about Agnes Pemberton being turned away, about a dozen other pensioners told the same lie. "And then?" Slack prompted. "Then I followed the money. Barclay wasn't as clever as he thought. I saw the new horses, supposedly rented, but I recognized them. Came from Hendrick's farm over in Much Benham. Hendricks told me Barclay bought them outright. Cash payment. That's when I knew." The room fell silent except for Mary's laboured breathing. Finally, Cartwright spoke again. "I didn't mean to kill him. I only wanted to embarrass him, make him fall in front of everyone, maybe get hurt enough that people would start asking questions. I weakened the harness, yes. But the firecracker, that wasn't me." Chapter 4. Secrets in the Stable. Miss Marple studied James Cartwright's weathered face, noting the genuine anguish in his eyes. In her considerable experience with human nature, she'd learned to distinguish between the guilt of murder and the guilt of unintended consequences. "Mr. Cartwright," she said gently, You say you didn't set off the firecracker. Did you see anyone else near the stable that night? No, but... He hesitated, glancing at his wife. I wasn't the only one who knew about Barclay's embezzlement. I'd been careful with my questions, but word spreads in a village. Agnes Pemberton knew. Robert Henley suspected. Even young Timothy's mother had started asking why the fund never seemed to have money despite all the fundraising. Inspector Slack paced the small room, his footsteps heavy on the worn wooden floor. So you're saying anyone could have set off that firecracker? Anyone who wanted Barclay exposed or dead, Cartwright confirmed. I provided the means with the weakened harness, but someone else provided the trigger. Miss Marple rose carefully. Inspector, perhaps we should examine the stable more thoroughly. In my experience, people often leave traces of themselves in places they believe won't be scrutinized. The stable stood quiet in the afternoon sun, its interior dim and rich with the smell of hay and horses. Robert Henley was mucking out stalls, his movements efficient despite his obvious reluctance to be there. Terrible business, he muttered as they entered. Those horses are still spooked, may never be good for pulling a sleigh again. Miss Marple walked slowly through the stable, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Near the back, partially hidden behind a feed bin, she spotted something interesting. A small tin that had once contained cough drops, now empty except for traces of gunpowder. Homemade firecracker, Slack identified. Crude but effective. The tin is from Pemberton's pharmacy, Miss Marple observed. They closed 5 years ago when Agnes's brother died. She kept some of the old stock, I believe. Henley had stopped working, leaning on his pitchfork. You think Agnes did this? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that we're dealing with more than one person seeking justice in their own way. Mr. Cartwright weakened the harness. Someone else, possibly Agnes, provided the spark. But there's something else troubling me. She moved to the sleigh, now damaged and pushed into a corner. Mr. Barclay was thrown with unusual force, Dr. Haydock said. More force than the accident alone would account for. You're suggesting he was pushed? Slack asked. I'm suggesting we should speak with the passengers from that final ride. They may have seen something in the confusion that seemed unimportant at the time. They found the London visitors at the inn, preparing to leave despite Slack's request that they remain available. Mrs. Worthington, a well-dressed woman in her 40s, was particularly eager to depart. It was horrible, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. One moment we were enjoying the ride, the next there was a loud bang, the horses reared, and Mr. Barclay stood up shouting. Then someone, I couldn't see who, seemed to lurch against him just as the harness snapped. Lurch against him? Miss Marple inquired. Yes, one of the men. It happened so fast. Mr. Barclay went flying over the side, and then we all tumbled out as the sleigh tipped. Her husband added, I thought it was just someone losing their balance, but now that you mention it, the push, if that's what it was, seemed almost deliberate. As they left the inn, Miss Marple noticed a figure watching from across the street. Timothy Wells stood partially hidden behind the post office corner, his young face troubled. Timothy, she called gently, is there something else you wanted to tell us? The boy approached reluctantly. It's about Mr. Henley, miss. I saw him that night too. Not at midnight like Mr. Cartwright, but earlier, around 10. He was with someone arguing. Who? I couldn't tell. They were in the shadows. But I heard Mr. Henley say something about teaching him a lesson and making sure he pays. Slack immediately turned back toward the stable, but Miss Marple caught his arm. Inspector, let me speak with Mr. Henley first. Sometimes a gentle approach yields more truth than confrontation. She found Henley sitting on a hay bale, his head in his hands. He looked up at her approach, his eyes red-rimmed. You know, don't you? He said simply. I know you had reason to hate Mr. Barclay, but I also know you're not a murderer, Mr. Henley. My sister, he said hoarsely. She applied to the fund 6 times. 6 times, Miss Marple. Each time Barclay said there was no money. She died in February, couldn't afford proper heating or medicine. When I found out about the embezzlement, his voice cracked with emotion. Chapter 5, The Weight of Winter. Robert Henley's confession came slowly, like ice melting under winter sun. Miss Marple sat beside him on the hay bale, her presence oddly comforting despite the circumstances. "I was in the sleigh that night," he admitted. "Paid for a ticket like anyone else. Wanted to look Barclay in the eye while he played the generous benefactor, knowing what he'd done." "And when the horses bolted?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "I didn't plan it. But when the firecracker went off and Barclay stood up shouting, trying to control the horses, I saw my chance. Everyone was screaming, tumbling about. I pushed him hard. He went over the side just as the harness snapped." Inspector Slack had arrived quietly, listening from the doorway. "So, we have 3 guilty parties. Cartwright weakened the harness, someone, likely Agnes, set off the firecracker, and you provided the final push." 4, Miss Marple corrected softly. "We mustn't forget Mr. Barclay himself, whose greed set this entire tragedy in motion." Agnes Pemberton, when confronted with the cough-drop tin, neither confirmed nor denied her involvement. She sat in her cold parlour, back straight as a board, and regarded Inspector Slack with steady eyes. "Prove it," she said simply. "Prove I was anywhere near that stable." "The tin," Slack began, "could have been taken from my rubbish any time in the last 5 years. I threw out dozens when the pharmacy closed." Miss Marple intervened. "Agnes, we're not here to persecute you. We're trying to understand what happened." Agnes's composure finally cracked slightly. Martha Hedges understood what happened. She understood that trusting Thomas Barclay meant freezing to death in her own home. She understood that charity had become commerce, that kindness had become cruelty. "You were there that night," Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. "I was walking. I often walk when I can't sleep, which is most nights, since Martha died. I saw the stable door open. I saw what James had done to the harness. I've enough medical training to recognize sabotage, and I thought, why not ensure it happens? Why not make certain that for once Thomas Barclay faces consequences? So, you set off the firecracker." "I lit a fuse to more than gunpowder, Miss Marple. I lit a fuse to justice." The investigation revealed the full extent of Barclay's embezzlement. Beyond the misappropriated funds, they found records of private sleigh rides throughout December, charging wealthy families premium rates for exclusive charity experiences, while pocketing every penny. He'd even been negotiating to sell the horses and sleigh after the season, planning to claim they'd been returned to their rental company. In his desk, they found a list of elderly residents who'd applied for heating assistance, with notes beside each name. "Too proud, won't complain, no family to advocate, confused, easily dismissed." Mary Cartwright's condition worsened as the investigation continued. Dr. Haydock privately informed Miss Marple that without immediate warmth and proper care, she might not survive the winter. The irony was bitter. The very fund meant to prevent such situations had been emptied by the man now lying in the morgue. "What will happen to them all?" Miss Marple asked Inspector Slack, as they stood in the village square watching the sunset paint the snow pink and gold. "That's for the courts to decide, though given the circumstances." He shrugged. "Cartwright's a war hero with a dying wife. Agnes is a respected elder who lost her best friend to Barclay's greed. Henley lost his sister. No jury in England would convict them of murder. Manslaughter, perhaps? Perhaps. More likely suspended sentences, considering the provocation." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the money? What's left of it will be returned to the fund. The horses and sleigh will be sold, legitimately this time. Should be enough to see our pensioners through the winter, at least." As they spoke, villagers began gathering in the square. Word had spread about the recovered funds, and an impromptu meeting was being organised to ensure proper distribution. Miss Marple noticed Agnes Pemberton and James Cartwright standing apart from the crowd, both looking isolated despite the community around them. "They meant to do right," she murmured. "In their own way, they all meant to do right." "The road to hell, Miss Marple," Slack said grimly. "Yes," she agreed. "Though sometimes, Inspector, that road is paved not with good intentions, but with other people's greed. Mr. Barclay paved his own road, stone by stone, with every penny he stole from those who needed it most." Chapter 6. Footprints in fresh snow. 2 days after the revelations in the stable, St. Mary Mead woke to fresh snowfall. Miss Marple stood at her window, watching the white blanket settle over the village, covering the ugly stains and disturbances of recent events. Yet she knew that snow, like silence, only concealed what lay beneath. It didn't erase it. A knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. Florence, her maid, announced Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple's oldest friend, who swept in bringing cold air and urgent energy. "Jane, I've just come from London. You won't believe what I've discovered about Thomas Barclay." Miss Marple poured tea as Mrs. Bantry settled herself, clearly bursting with news. "I was lunching with my cousin. You remember, the one who works at the Charity Commission. And I mentioned our recent tragedy. She nearly choked on her soup. It seems Mr. Barclay was already under investigation." "Indeed," Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm. 3 other charities he'd been involved with had reported irregularities. Small villages, all of them, where people were less likely to make formal complaints. The Commission was building a case, but Barclay was clever, never took quite enough to trigger automatic audits, always had explanations for discrepancies. Yet he grew bolder here in St. Mary Mead. "That's just it, Jane. He wasn't supposed to be here much longer. My cousin says he'd applied for a position with a national charity, managing director no less. Can you imagine? He would have had access to hundreds of thousands of pounds." Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Then our villagers, in their desperate act, may have prevented a much larger tragedy. That's one way to look at it, though I doubt the magistrates will see it quite that way." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mary Cartwright. Dr. Haydock had moved her to the cottage hospital, where she could receive proper care. James sat beside her bed, holding her hand, looking older than his 70 years. "Miss Marple," he said, rising stiffly. "Good of you to come. How is she?" "Better. The warmth helps, and knowing that." He paused. "The other pensioners have been visiting. Agnes Pemberton brought soup yesterday. Even Robert Henley stopped by. It's strange how tragedy brings people together." Mary's eyes opened, focusing with difficulty on Miss Marple. "James told me everything," she whispered. "What he did, what they all did. And I would have done the same." Her voice was firm despite its weakness. "That money was meant for people like us, people who worked all their lives only to be abandoned when we needed help most. Barclay stole more than money. He stole dignity, hope, life itself." Miss Marple found Inspector Slack at the police station, surrounded by paperwork. He looked up irritably as she entered. "The Crown Prosecutor is making a mess of this," he complained. 3 different people contributed to one death, each without knowledge of the other's actions. How do you charge that? And with public sympathy entirely on their side. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, "the question isn't how to charge them, but whether justice has already been served in its own way." "That's not how the law works, Miss Marple." "No, but it is how villages work, Inspector. St. Mary Mead has already passed its judgment. Look outside." From the window they could see a crowd gathered at the church. Donations were being collected, not for a charity this time, but directly for the affected pensioners. Agnes Pemberton stood with a ledger, carefully recording every penny. Robert Henley and James Cartwright worked side by side, distributing coal vouchers. "They're doing what Barclay should have done," Miss Marple observed, "ensuring no one freezes this winter." Young Timothy Wells appeared at the station door. "Inspector, Miss Marple, there's something else you should know, about the night Mr. Barclay died." The boy looked troubled, shifting from foot to foot. "I saw someone else that night, someone nobody's mentioned." "Who?" Slack demanded. "Mrs. Barclay. She was at the edge of the green, watching, and when the accident happened, when everyone ran to help, she just turned and walked away." This revelation sent Slack into action. Mrs. Barclay had left for London immediately after the funeral, claiming she couldn't bear to stay in St. Mary Mead, but now her presence that night took on new significance. "Did she know?" Slack muttered, reaching for the telephone. "Did she know what her husband was doing, or what was going to happen to him?" Miss Marple, however, had a different thought. "Timothy, did Mrs. Barclay appear surprised when the accident occurred?" The boy considered. "No, miss. Now that you mention it, she looked resigned, like she'd been expecting something." Chapter 7. The Widow's Tale. Mrs. Constance Barclay sat in her London flat, perfectly composed despite Inspector Slack's unexpected arrival. She was a handsome woman of 45, with prematurely grey hair and tired eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much disappointment. The flat itself spoke of reduced circumstances, good furniture growing shabby, quality curtains fading at the edges, the kind of genteel decline that suggested money troubles carefully hidden. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, gesturing for them to sit. Miss Marple had accompanied Slack, her presence somehow making the interview feel less like an interrogation. The elderly detective noticed the photograph frames turned face down on the mantelpiece, the gaps on the walls where pictures had been removed. "You were present the night your husband died," Slack stated. "Yet you never mentioned this to anyone, not even when directly questioned." "Would it have changed anything? Thomas was dead. I couldn't help him, couldn't save him. I could only do what I'd done for 20 years of marriage, stand at the edges and watch while he performed his great charitable pantomime." "You knew about the charity fraud," Miss Marple said gently, observing how Mrs. Barclay's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea from a china service that had seen better days. Mrs. Barclay's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Knew? I helped him establish the charity in the first place. I wrote the original mission statement, designed the donation cards, even knitted scarves for our first fundraiser. I thought we were doing something good, something meaningful. It took me 2 years to realise the books didn't balance, another year to confirm my suspicions, and 3 more to accept that my husband was a thief dressed in philanthropist's clothing." "Why didn't you report him?" Slack asked, though his tone had softened considerably. "To whom? The police? The shame would have destroyed us both. My family would have been mortified. They're already barely speaking to me for marrying beneath my station, as they put it. The villagers? They worship Thomas, the great benefactor with his jolly manner and generous spirit. Who would believe the bitter wife over the charitable gentleman? I'd be dismissed as jealous, grasping, perhaps mad." She rose, moving to the window that overlooked a busy street where London life continued indifferently below. "I tried to leave him 3 times. The first time I'd packed my bags and made it to the station before he found me. He cried, 'Inspector,' got on his knees right there on the platform and sobbed. Said he'd change, stop taking the money, promised to make amends, and I believed him, because I wanted to believe that the man I'd married still existed somewhere inside that grotesque performance of generosity. The second time," Miss Marple prompted, "I'd found evidence of a new theft, £500 meant for coal deliveries redirected to his personal account. I confronted him, threatened divorce. He laughed at first, then turned nasty, reminded me I had no money of my own, no family who'd take me in after the scandal of divorce. Then he became pathetic again, weeping about his childhood poverty, his fear of ending up destitute like his father. I stayed out of pity and cowardice in equal measure. And the third time," Mrs. Barclay turned from the window, her face mask-like in its control. "That was 6 months ago. I discovered he was stealing not just from the fund, but from me. My mother's jewellery, pieces I'd hidden away, he'd been selling them one by one. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it, said it was all family money anyway, and he was the head of the family. That's when I knew I wasn't married to a flawed man trying to be better, but to something else entirely. Something that wore Thomas's face but had no soul behind it." "But you knew something would happen that night," Slack pressed. "Timothy Wells saw you at the Green watching." "I knew the village was angry. I'd heard whispers in shops, seen looks of pure hatred directed at Thomas when he wasn't watching. When Agnes Pemberton's friend died last winter, Martha, Hedges, something shifted. The deference became suspicion. The gratitude turned to resentment. I warned Thomas, told him people were asking questions, but he wouldn't listen. He never listened to anyone who wasn't praising him." Miss Marple studied the woman's profile. "You could have warned him that night specifically. You saw something, didn't you?" Mrs. Barclay returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 45 years and more. "I saw James Cartwright leaving the stable around 11 o'clock. The way he walked, furtive, checking over his shoulder. I knew he'd done something. James is many things, but subtle isn't one of them. His guilt was written in every step." "You knew the harness had been tampered with?" I suspected. Thomas had made James's life hell, denying help while his wife grew sicker. And James had that look, the same look my father had when he came home from the war. The look of a man who'd crossed a line he'd sworn never to cross but felt justified in the crossing. She paused, sipping her tea with mechanical precision. I could have warned Thomas, could have suggested we check the equipment, could have prevented him from taking that last ride. I stood there in the shadows, watching him climb into that sleigh with those London people, playing the gracious host, the generous benefactor. And I did nothing. That makes you an accessory, Slack said, though without real conviction. Does it? I had no specific knowledge of what James had done. For all I knew, he'd simply stolen something from the stable, or left a gate open to let the horses escape. I never imagined. Death wasn't in my mind, Inspector. Humiliation, perhaps. Exposure, hopefully. But not death. Miss Marple leaned forward. But there's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told us about that night or about your husband's plans. The widow's composure finally cracked like ice under spring sun. The horses, she whispered. Thomas wasn't just stealing from the charity. He was planning to leave. Leave me. Leave St. Mary Mead. Leave everything. He'd been corresponding with a woman in Brighton, someone he'd met at a charity conference. Victoria Pembroke, young enough to be his daughter, impressed by his supposed generosity. She stood abruptly, moving to an escritoire in the corner. From a locked drawer she withdrew a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, a mockery of romantic correspondence. He'd been promising her a new life, funded by one last grand theft. He was going to empty the charity account completely after Christmas, claim the money had been distributed to pensioners who would never see a penny, and disappear with her to start fresh abroad. Switzerland, he'd written. Somewhere banking laws would protect his stolen funds. She handed the letters to Slack, who read them with growing disgust. They detailed not just the financial fraud, but Berkeley's complete contempt for everyone in St. Mary Mead, referring to the villagers as a sheep, fools, and worse. I found these the morning he died, Mrs. Berkeley continued. He'd already bought train tickets, boat tickets, even arranged for new identity documents. He was going to leave me with nothing. No money, no explanation, just debts and disgrace. 20 years of marriage ending with abandonment. You must have been furious, Miss Marple observed. Furious? I was empty, hollow, like all my insides had been scooped out and replaced with winter air. I dressed, went to the green to watch the sleigh rides as if nothing had changed. I was going to confront him afterward, tell him I knew everything, that I'd go to the police if he left. But fate, or perhaps justice, intervened. She laughed, a sound devoid of humour. Do you know what his last words to me were? That morning, as he left to prepare for the evening's rides? Don't wait up, Constance. I might be quite late. He was planning to leave that very night, after playing benefactor one last time. The accident saved me from the ultimate humiliation, being abandoned for a younger woman with my mother's jewellery funding their new life. Slack set down the letters, his expression troubled. These should have been given to us immediately. They're evidence. Evidence of what? That my husband was even worse than anyone imagined? That his death saved not just the pensioners but me from complete destruction? Yes, I suppose they are evidence of that. Mrs. Berkeley, Miss Marple said quietly, when you stood watching that night, when you chose not to warn him, were you hoping something would happen? The widow met her eyes directly. I was hoping for a miracle, Miss Marple, for something to stop him from destroying everything and everyone he touched. I didn't pray for his death, but when it happened, God help me. My first feeling was relief, deep, profound relief that it was over, that he couldn't hurt anyone else. And now, Slack asked, now I live with the knowledge that I could have saved him and chose not to. Some would call that murder by omission. I call it the first honest thing I'd done in years, refusing to save a man who was drowning others while he swam to shore. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Berkeley had one more revelation. There's something else you should know. The woman in Brighton, Victoria Pembroke, she's been writing to me. She thought Thomas had abandoned her, you see. She had no idea he was dead until she saw the newspaper. She's pregnant, Inspector. Thomas's child, she claims. Another life he created and abandoned before he even knew of its existence. The journey back to St. Mary Mead was conducted in contemplative silence. Finally, Slack spoke. She knew something would happen and did nothing. That's criminal negligence at least. Is it? Miss Marple asked. She didn't know anyone would be hurt, only suspected that some form of sabotage might expose her husband's crimes. Can we prosecute someone for failing to prevent an accident they couldn't have predicted? And more importantly, should we? The woman has lost everything. Her husband, her security, her future. She's left with debts, disgrace, and the knowledge that the man she married was a monster wearing a charitable mask. The law, Inspector, must deal with facts. The fact is that Mrs. Barclay neither contributed to nor had specific knowledge of the fatal incident. She suspected something, but not murder. In my experience, suspicion without action is not a crime, though it may be a sin she'll carry forever. Back in St. Mary Mead, the recovered charity funds were being distributed under Agnes Pemberton's careful supervision. Every elderly resident would receive enough for heating through the winter, with surplus going toward an emergency fund for the next year. The village had responded to tragedy with renewed community spirit, but Miss Marple could see the shadows that lingered, the weight of collective guilt over a death that many had secretly wished for. Chapter 8. Judgment Day. The magistrate's court in Much Benham had never seen such crowds. The gallery was packed with villagers from St. Mary Mead, many of whom had risen before dawn to secure seats. Outside, those who couldn't fit inside clustered around the windows, despite the bitter cold. Miss Marple sat in the third row, her knitting needles still as she observed the proceedings with her characteristic attention to human nature. The courthouse itself seemed to emphasize the gravity of the occasion. High ceilings that echoed every cough and whisper, dark wood panels that had witnessed centuries of justice and injustice alike, and the royal coat of arms above the magistrate's bench serving as a reminder that this was the Crown's justice being dispensed. James Cartwright stood first, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. He'd polished his medals until they shone, the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Medal with Bar, campaign medals from a lifetime of service. His lawyer, Mr. Pettigrew, provided by a collection taken up by the village, was a young man with old eyes who understood that this case was about more than law. "My client," Pettigrew began, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "is a man who served his country with distinction for 30 years. A man who asked for nothing more in his retirement than the ability to keep his wife warm through winter. Instead, he found himself watching her slip toward death, while the very fund established to prevent such tragedies was being systematically plundered." Pettigrew presented evidence of the Cartwrights' applications to the fund, 3 formal requests, each more desperate than the last. The final one, written in Mary's shaking hand, simply read, "Please help us. I don't want to die cold." "This letter," Pettigrew continued, "was dated 3 days before my client's actions. 3 days during which Mrs. Cartwright's temperature dropped to dangerous levels, during which she coughed blood, during which her husband, a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, was reduced to burning furniture to keep her alive." The prosecutor, Mr. Whitfield from London, stood to cross-examine. He was a thin man with a reedy voice that seemed to irritate rather than command attention. "Mr. Cartwright, you admit to deliberately damaging the harness?" "I do," Cartwright replied firmly, "with the intention of causing an accident." "With the intention of exposing a thief and a fraud. But you must have known physical harm could result from your actions." Cartwright's jaw tightened. "I knew Barclay would be embarrassed, possibly injured. I didn't intend death. I'm not a murderer, Mr. Whitfield. I'm a desperate man who watched his wife dying while a criminal played at charity. Yet, you took the law into your own hands." "The law," Cartwright said, his voice rising slightly, "was nowhere to be found when my wife needed heat. The law didn't investigate Barclay's fraud. The law didn't prevent Martha Hedges from freezing to death. Where was the law then, Mr. Whitfield?" A murmur of approval rippled through the gallery before the magistrate called for order. Agnes Pemberton's case was presented next. Without direct evidence linking her to the firecracker beyond the circumstantial tin, her lawyer, Miss Harbottle, one of the few female lawyers in the county, argued persuasively. The prosecution asks you to believe that my client, an 82-year-old former nurse with arthritis in both hands, crafted a firecracker, crept to the stable undetected, and set it off at precisely the right moment to cause maximum chaos. This is not evidence, Your Honour. This is speculation built on coincidence. Agnes sat throughout with remarkable composure, her face showing neither guilt nor innocence, only a kind of weary dignity. When asked to speak, she rose slowly. "I won't deny I hated Thomas Barclay," she said, her voice carrying surprising strength. "He killed my dearest friend through greed and negligence. Martha Hedges died alone and cold because a man she trusted stole money meant for her survival. If hatred were a crime, I would plead guilty. But hatred is not action, and you have no proof of action." The prosecutor struggled with Agnes. Every question he asked seemed to generate sympathy rather than suspicion. When he suggested she had means and motive, she responded simply, "So, did every pensioner in St. Mary Mead? Will you arrest them all?" Robert Henley's confession complicated matters. His admission to pushing Barclay from the sleigh was unequivocal, but his lawyer, Mr. Thornton, painted a devastating picture of grief and momentary madness. "My client's sister, Eleanor Henley, died on February 15th of this year. She was 67 years old, a spinster who had worked as a governess her entire adult life, saving carefully for retirement she barely lived to see. When illness struck, she applied to the Warmth for Winter Fund 6 times. 6 times she was told there was no money available." Thornton produced Eleanor's diary, reading entries that chronicled her declining health and increasing desperation. The final entry, dated 3 days before her death, read, "I shall die as I lived, alone, forgotten, and now it seems frozen. Mr. Barclay assured me again today that the fund has no money. I wonder where it all goes." "My client," Thornton continued, discovered after his sister's death that the fund had received over £300 in donations that very month. While Eleanor Henley died, Thomas Barclay was purchasing horses with money meant for heating. When presented with this man on the night of the sleigh rides, this man whose greed had killed his sister, Robert Henley experienced what psychiatrists call a dissociative episode. He acted not with premeditation, but with the volcanic eruption of suppressed grief and rage. Dr. Haydock was called as a witness, testifying to the medical aspects of the case. Mrs. Cartwright would have died without immediate warmth and medication. Eleanor Henley did die, primarily from pneumonia exacerbated by prolonged exposure to cold. Martha Hedges froze to death in her own cottage. As a physician, I can state categorically that Thomas Barclay's embezzlement directly contributed to these medical crises. The most powerful moment came when Mrs. Bantry, representing the charitable organisations of the county, took the stand. "We've conducted a thorough investigation of the Warmth for Winter Fund," she stated. "What we found was systematic fraud extending back 3 years. Mr. Barclay stole approximately £2,000, money that should have heated dozens of homes through multiple winters. We calculate that his theft affected at least 40 elderly residents, of whom 3 died directly from cold-related conditions." The prosecutor made one last attempt to assert the law. Whatever Mr. Barclay's crimes, these defendants took justice into their own hands. They conspired to... They did not conspire, all 3 defence lawyers said almost simultaneously. Pettigrew continued. Each acted independently without knowledge of the other's actions. Mr. Cartwright weakened the harness alone. Someone, possibly my client, possibly not, set off a firecracker alone. Mr. Henley pushed Barclay alone. There was no conspiracy, only a tragic confluence of individual anger, reaching breaking point at the same moment. During a recess, Miss Marple encountered the prosecutor in the corridor. He looked exhausted and somewhat defeated. "You're fighting the entire village," she observed gently. "I'm fighting emotion with law," he replied. "The law is clear. These people committed crimes." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but justice is not always clear, is it? These people committed crimes in response to a greater crime that the law had failed to address. The question before the court is not just guilt or innocence, but whether the law serves justice or merely itself." When testimony resumed, character witnesses created a portrait of 3 defendants whose lives had been exemplary until pushed beyond endurance. The vicar testified to James Cartwright's decades of quiet service, maintaining the church grounds without payment, helping elderly neighbours with repairs, never asking for anything in return. The postmaster described Agnes Pemberton's years as an unofficial district nurse after retirement, tending to sick villagers without compensation, often buying medicines with her own pension money. The blacksmith spoke of Robert Henley's devotion to his sister, how he'd turned down opportunities to work at prestigious stables to stay near her, ensuring she wasn't alone in her declining years. Then came the elderly residents themselves. One by one they testified to winters without heat, choosing between food and coal, the shame of begging for help from a fund supposedly flush with donations. Mr. Patterson, 90 years old and walking with 2 canes, spoke with quiet dignity. I worked from age 12 to 75. Never took charity, always paid my way, but when I couldn't afford coal last winter, I applied to Mr. Barclay's fund. He told me funds were allocated for the year, suggested I might ask my children for help. My son died in the war, Mr. Magistrate. My daughter emigrated to Australia. I spent January sleeping in my clothes, wearing every garment I owned. That's what Thomas Barclay's charity meant to people like me. Mrs. Barclay herself was recalled from London to testify. Her appearance caused a sensation, the widow of the victim speaking for the defendants. My husband's actions caused immeasurable harm, she said quietly. These people acted wrongly, but they acted from pain my husband inflicted deliberately and repeatedly. He was planning to flee the country with the charity's remaining funds. His death, while tragic, prevented greater tragedy. I cannot condemn those who acted from desperation he created. By the time all testimony was complete, the courtroom felt less like a hall of justice and more like a confessional where an entire community's pain had been laid bare. The magistrate, Sir Edmund Hartley, deliberated for 3 hours. When he returned, the courtroom fell silent. His expression was grave but not without compassion, a man who understood he was judging not just crimes but the complete breakdown of social contract. This case, he began, represents a failure at every level of our society. The failure of charity perverted into theft, the failure of oversight that allowed such theft to continue, the failure of systems meant to protect our most vulnerable citizens, and ultimately, the failure that occurs when good people are pushed beyond the bounds of law by circumstances the law should have prevented. He paused, looking directly at each defendant. The law requires me to consider not just the acts committed, but the circumstances that prompted them. Mr. Cartwright, your sabotage of the harness was reckless and dangerous. It could have resulted in multiple deaths. However, the court recognizes the extreme provocation of your wife's near-fatal illness and the systematic denial of assistance you faced. Miss Pemberton, the evidence against you is entirely circumstantial. The prosecution has failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you were responsible for the firecracker. You are free to go without stain on your character. Agnes showed no emotion, merely nodding once with dignity and tact. Mr. Henley, your action in pushing Mr. Barclay was assault resulting in death. There can be no question of that. However, the court recognizes the extraordinary emotional distress you were under, having recently lost your sister to the same greed that was being flaunted before you that night. The magistrate looked out over the packed courtroom, seeing faces tense with anxiety and hope. It is the judgment of this court that Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Henley be sentenced to 12 months' imprisonment. A gasp went through the crowd. However, this sentence is suspended for 2 years, conditional upon good behaviour and 200 hours of community service each. Additionally, they are to assist in the proper administration of the reconstituted Warmth for Winter Fund, ensuring that never again will such corruption take root. The courtroom erupted. Some wept with relief, others applauded despite the bailiff's calls for order. Miss Marple noticed the prosecutor shaking his head, but making no motion to appeal. Perhaps even he recognised that justice, in its truest form, had been served. Not the cold justice of statute, but the human justice that recognises extremity of circumstance. Chapter 9. After the thaw. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with unusual warmth that year, as if nature itself wished to compensate for the harsh winter that had claimed too much. The village, like the earth, seemed to be experiencing a renewal, not just of season, but of spirit. Miss Marple, walking through the village on a particularly fine April morning, reflected on how tragedy had transformed into something approaching redemption. The Warmth for Winter Fund had been completely restructured. A board of trustees now oversaw its operations, with Agnes Pemberton as chair, James Cartwright as treasurer, and surprisingly, Mrs. Barclay as secretary. The fund's accounts were published monthly in the parish newsletter, every penny tracked and accounted for. In the 3 months since the trial, they'd raised more money than Barclay had stolen in 3 years. Miss Marple paused at the cottage hospital, where Mary Cartwright now volunteered 3 days a week. Through the window, she could see Mary reading to other patients, her voice strong and clear, a far cry from the dying woman of the previous winter. "Miss Marple," Dr. Haydock called out, emerging from the hospital. "Perfect timing. I wanted to tell you, we've just received an anonymous donation of £500 for the hospital's heating fund. Any idea who might be our benefactor?" Miss Marple had her suspicions. Mrs. Barclay had recently sold some valuable jewellery that had escaped her husband's theft, but merely smiled. How wonderful. Anonymous charity is often the most genuine, don't you think? She continued to the church, where she found James Cartwright meticulously updating the fund's ledgers. His community service had transformed into voluntary dedication. Every application was processed within days, every distribution recorded with military precision. "No one will ever wonder where the money goes again," he told Miss Marple. "Complete transparency. Martha Hedges and Eleanor Henley deserve that much at least." "How is your community service progressing?" "Finished last week, officially. But I'll continue with the fund work. It feels like atonement, I suppose. For what I did, but also for what I didn't do earlier. I should have challenged Barclay sooner, more openly." "Hindsight often brings clarity that crisis clouds," Miss Marple observed gently. At the vicarage, she found an unexpected gathering. Agnes Pemberton was hosting a tea for elderly residents, using her own funds to provide a weekly social occasion that combined company with practical support. The woman who had probably, set off the firecracker that triggered Barclay's death, now served those he had betrayed. "Miss Marple, do join us," Agnes called out. "We're discussing the summer fund drive. A garden party, we think, with complete transparency about where every donation goes." Mrs. Patterson, the 90-year-old who had testified at the trial, was holding court in the corner. "Never thought I'd see the day when charity meant charity again," he said. "That Barclay, he turned us all into beggars. Now we're neighbours helping neighbours, as it should be." Miss Marple noticed Timothy Wells helping serve tea, the boy having attached himself to the fund's activities with youthful enthusiasm. He'd started a small newsletter, interviewing elderly residents about their needs and sharing their stories with potential donors. "It was Timothy's idea," Agnes explained. "He said people donate more when they see faces and know stories, not just statistics. The boy has wisdom beyond his years." That wisdom, Miss Marple reflected, had been hard-earned through witnessing violence born from desperation. Timothy had seen his community fracture and rebuild itself, learning lessons about human nature that would shape his entire life. In the afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Barclay in her new cottage, a modest dwelling on Church Lane that she'd rented after selling the family home. The widow was working in her small garden, planting what appeared to be a memorial rose garden. "Each rose for someone affected by Thomas's theft," she explained, brushing soil from her hands. It seemed appropriate. Beauty from ashes, growth from grief. "And how are you? Finding village life now?" Mrs. Barclay considered the question. "Surprisingly welcoming. I expected ostracism to be forever marked as the fraudster's wife. Instead, I've found acceptance, even friendship. Mrs. Patterson brought me soup last week. James Cartwright fixed my garden gate without being asked. It's as if by acknowledging our shared pain we've moved past blame." "And the young woman in Brighton, Victoria?" Mrs. Barclay's expression tightened slightly. "I've been supporting her. It seemed the right thing to do. The The child is innocent of its father's crimes. She'll name it Martin if it's a boy, Martha if it's a girl, after Martha Hedges. A strange memorial, but perhaps fitting. As evening approached, Miss Marple attended a gathering at the village hall. It wasn't an official meeting, but rather a spontaneous assembly that had become weekly tradition. Villagers gathered to share news, offer help, and simply be together. The isolation that had allowed Barclay's fraud to flourish had been replaced by deliberate community. Robert Henley had sent a letter from Ireland, read aloud by his friend the blacksmith. I think of St. Mary Mead often, with both sorrow and strange gratitude. Sorrow for what happened, gratitude that it led to change. I'm sending what I can to the fund and hope someday to return when the memories don't cut quite so sharp. Tell everyone I'm well and that Eleanor would be pleased to know her death meant something in the end. Inspector Slack made an unexpected appearance, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the informal setting. No new crimes, I hope, he said to Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea. Only the ordinary human failings, Inspector. Nothing requiring your professional attention. Good. This case, it changed how I think about justice. The law is clear, but sometimes clarity isn't the same as righteousness. A valuable lesson for anyone in authority, Miss Marple agreed. As the gathering continued, she noticed how the dynamics had shifted. Those who had been victims, the elderly denied heat, now had voice and agency. Those who had acted in desperation were neither heroes nor pariahs, but complex humans who had faced impossible choices. Even Barclay, the villain of the piece, was spoken of with more pity than hatred, a man whose greed had ultimately destroyed him. Young Timothy Wells approached her with his notebook. Miss Marple, I'm writing about what happened for my school project. My teacher says it's too dark, but I think it's important. People should know how things can go wrong and how they can be made right again. What will you call your project? The Winter That Changed Everything. Because it did, didn't it? Everything changed. Indeed it had, Miss Marple reflected. The comfortable assumptions about charity and community had been shattered, but from those fragments something stronger had been built. The village had learned that kindness without oversight could become cruelty, that desperation could drive good people to dark acts, and that justice sometimes wore a face the law didn't recognize. As she walked home through the mild spring evening, Miss Marple passed the spot where Barclay's sleigh had overturned. The bench installed there, in memory of those winter forgot, had become a gathering spot for elderly residents, a place to rest and chat and remember they were not alone. Mrs. Dawlish was sitting there, wearing a new coat purchased with fund money, talking animatedly with Agnes Pemberton about plans for a summer reading group at the library. Miss Marple, Mrs. Dawlish called out, Agnes is teaching me to knit. She says it's therapeutic, keeping one's hands busy while sorting through difficult thoughts. Very true, Miss Marple agreed. I've solved many problems with my needles clicking. Perhaps you could teach us that pattern you were working on. The lover's knot, wasn't it? The one found with poor Mr. Barclay? Miss Marple considered. I think perhaps a different pattern would be better. The lover's knot is beautiful but complicated, and sometimes it's better to start fresh with something simpler and cleaner. As she continued home, she reflected that the same could be said of St. Mary Mead itself. The complex, knotted pattern of Barclay's deception had been unravelled through desperate violence, but what was being knitted in its place was simpler, cleaner, and ultimately stronger. A community that had learned to watch for the wolves among the sheep, to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves, and to ensure that never again would charity become a mask for cruelty. Chapter 10. The Final Stitch. 1 year later, on a crisp December evening, St. Mary Mead gathered on the village green for the first annual Martha Hedges Memorial Winter Fair. The transformation from the previous year's tragedy was complete. Where once Thomas Barclay's fraudulent sleigh rides had promised charity while delivering theft, now genuine community support flourished in every corner of the festively decorated square. Miss Marple sat on the same bench that marked the spot of Barclay's death, now surrounded by winter roses that Mrs. Barclay had planted in the spring. Dr. Haydock joined her, bringing 2 cups of mulled cider from the nearest stall. No sleigh rides this year, he observed, watching children chase each other through the maze of charity booths. No, Miss Marple agreed. Some traditions are better left buried with those who corrupted them, though I notice young Timothy has organised pony rides for the children, with all proceeds properly documented. Timothy Wells, now 14 and showing the first hints of the man he would become, had thrown himself into the fairs organisation with remarkable maturity. His notebook was ever present, recording donations, expenses and distributions, with a transparency that would have been foreign to Thomas Barclay's operation. "The boy's been changed by all this," Dr. Haydock commented. "His mother says he wants to become a journalist, to expose corruption wherever he finds it." "Every generation needs its watchdogs," Miss Marple replied. "Timothy learned young that silence in the face of wrongdoing can have fatal consequences." Agnes Pemberton approached, carrying her inevitable ledger and cash box, but her severe expression had softened over the months. Her role as fund administrator had given her new purpose, channeling her grief and anger into meticulous service. "We've raised enough to see everyone through winter twice over," she reported with satisfaction. "And we've established an emergency medical fund for situations like Mary Cartwright's illness last year. We're calling it the Martha Hedges Medical Reserve." "Martha would be proud," Miss Marple said gently. "Her death sparked the change that will prevent others from suffering as she did." Agnes's eyes misted slightly, a show of emotion that would have been unthinkable from her a year ago. "I hope she knows that her death meant something, that it was the catalyst for everything that followed. Sometimes I dream about her, and in my dreams she's warm." James and Mary Cartwright manned a woodworking stall together, their crafts simple but well made, every piece labelled with price and purpose. Mary's recovery had been complete, her health restored by warmth and care that should never have been denied. They caught Miss Marple's eye and waved, their faces showing a peace that had been hard won. "James still struggles with what he did," Mary had confided to Miss Marple earlier. "He wakes sometimes, remembering the moment he cut those harness straps. He says he can still feel the leather giving way under his knife." But watching them now, working side by side, Miss Marple saw a couple who had survived the unsurvivable and emerged stronger. Their bond, tested by nearness to death and the guilt of causing it, had held. Robert Henley's absence was felt, but understood. He'd sent a letter to be read at the fair, along with a substantial donation from his earnings in Ireland. "Dear friends of St. Mary Mead, I think of you all daily, especially on cold nights, when I remember my sister Eleanor and all those who suffered from one man's greed. What we did, what I did, was wrong in the eyes of the law, but necessary in the arithmetic of justice. I pushed a man to his death, and I live with that truth every day. But I also live knowing that his death prevented greater suffering. I hope someday to return when the weight of memory becomes bearable. Until then, know that you're in my thoughts, and that Eleanor's name is remembered here in Ireland, where I've established a small fund for elderly horse trainers who can no longer work. It seemed fitting. She loved horses, though she could never afford to ride." Mrs. Barclay emerged from the church where she'd been organising the carol service. She'd found her place in the village not as the fraudulent benefactor's widow, but as a woman, earning her own redemption through quiet service. Her transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable, from enabler through silence to active participant in restitution. "Miss Marple," she said, joining the elderly detective, "I wanted to tell you, Victoria had her baby last week. A girl. She named her Martha Jane. The Jane is for you," she said, "for the lady who sees truth when others see only surface." Miss Marple was touched. "I merely observed what was already there." "No," Mrs. Barclay disagreed. "You saw through the performances we all gave. Thomas's performance of generosity, my performance of ignorant wife, even the villagers' performance of contentment while they froze. You saw the truth beneath it all." As afternoon faded to evening, candles were lit around the green, creating pools of warm light in the winter darkness. The vicar led a brief service honouring those lost to winter's cruelty, not just Martha Hedges and Eleanor Henley, but others in surrounding villages who'd suffered from similar neglect. It had been discovered that Barclay's fraud was part of a larger pattern of charity corruption in small villages, leading to new oversight regulations nationally. Young Timothy Wells, voice cracking with adolescence but carrying clearly across the silent crowd, read a poem he'd written. Winter's weight bore down on those forgotten, while false charity wore generous disguise. Frozen hearts and frozen homes were gotten through smiles that masked the greed in donors' eyes. But desperate hands can weave their own rough justice when law and mercy fail to hear the cry of those who freeze while others count their profits. Sometimes the only answer is goodbye. We gather now where tragedy was written, in snow and blood and charity betrayed, to warm the hearts that greed had once frostbitten, and honour those whose lives were roughly weighed. Let memory keep us vigilant and wary, for charity unchained becomes theft's tool. True giving asks no praise and needs no glory. It simply keeps the elderly from the cold's cruel rule. Inspector Slack, visiting for the occasion, stood beside Miss Marple as the service concluded. His usual sourness had mellowed over the year, replaced by something approaching philosophical acceptance. A year ago, this village was ready to tear itself apart, he observed. 3 people contributed to a man's death. And yet look at them now, united, prosperous, caring for each other. Crisis reveals character, Inspector. St. Mary Mead's character proved stronger than one man's greed. The violence was wrong, certainly, but it came from love. Love for dying spouses, love for lost friends, love for sister gone too soon. That love, once freed from the desperation that twisted it into violence, has become the foundation for something better. And those who caused Barclay's death? Do you think they've found peace? Miss Marple watched James Cartwright helping an elderly neighbour carry her purchases, saw Agnes Pemberton, carefully recording donations with perfect transparency, remembered Robert Henley's letter with its mix of guilt and purpose. Peace? Perhaps not, but purpose certainly. They've transformed their guilt into service, their anger into advocacy. Mr. Cartwright ensures no fund will ever be mismanaged again. Agnes has become the guardian of charitable integrity. Even Robert Henley from afar continues the work. They're serving sentences more meaningful than any prison term. Justice through service rather than punishment, Slack mused. There's something almost biblical about it. Or simply human. We all seek redemption in our own ways, Inspector. These people found theirs in preventing others from suffering as they suffered. As the fair wound down, villagers began the tradition they'd spontaneously created, each person placing a small candle around the memorial bench, creating a circle of light in the darkness. It had become a moment of remembrance not just for those who died, but for the innocents lost when trust was betrayed. Miss Marple walked home through streets dusted with the first snow of the season. She paused at her garden gate, looking back at the village she'd called home for so many years. The lights from cottage windows glowed warmly, windows that would stay warm all winter thanks to the reconstituted fund. Inside her cottage, she picked up the knitting she'd been working on, a blanket for the fund's emergency supplies, ready for whoever might need warmth in the coming winter. As her needles began their familiar rhythm, she reflected on the case that had shattered and rebuilt St. Mary Mead. Thomas Barclay had frozen hearts with his greed, turned the warmth of charity into the cold calculation of theft. In response, the village had cracked like ice under pressure, violent fractures spreading from the point of impact. But from those cracks had flowed something unexpected. Not just water, but warmth, genuine community, real charity. The sleigh ride Sabotage had been a crime born from multiple desperations converging on a single moment of opportunity. Each actor, James with his knife, Agnes with her firecracker, Robert with his push, had struck their own blow against injustice, unknowing that others shared their desperate anger. Together, they'd ended one life and saved many more. Was it justice? Law and morality rarely aligned perfectly in Miss Marple's long experience. The law would have imprisoned them for their actions while letting Barclay's theft continue, until bureaucracy eventually noticed. Morality might have demanded they suffer as martyrs rather than act as killers. But human nature, complex and contradictory, had found its own solution. Violent, wrong, but ultimately transformative. She held up her knitting, examining the pattern critically. One small mistake early on could distort the entire work, requiring either acceptance of the flaw or complete unravelling to start again. Mrs. Clement, for that's who Mrs. Barclay, would always be to her, the vicar's wife trying to hide from the pattern of her past, had made such a mistake years ago, and Thomas Berkeley's arrival in St. Mary Mead had threatened to unravel everything she'd built since. But wait, Miss Marple's needles paused. A memory stirred, something about patterns and names. She set down her knitting and reached for her correspondence, finding the letter from Mrs. Bantry about the Charity Commission's investigation. Yes, there it was. Thomas Berkeley had been investigated before, in other villages, always managing to escape before charges could be filed. A thought struck her with sudden clarity. Had Berkeley come to St. Mary Mead by chance, or had he known something about the village that made it attractive? Had he perhaps researched charitable giving in various villages and noticed St. Mary Mead's generous nature? Or had there been something more, some knowledge that made him choose this particular village for what he'd planned as his final, greatest theft? She would never know for certain. Berkeley had taken his motivations to his grave, trampled into the snow along with his pretensions of charity. But the possibility that he'd chosen St. Mary Mead deliberately, seeing it as perfect for exploitation, added another layer to the tragedy. He'd viewed their kindness as weakness, their trust as opportunity. The clock chimed midnight, its bronze voice carrying across the now quiet village. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and prepared for bed, but not before looking once more out her window at the village sleeping beneath its blanket of new snow. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, small dramas and minor mysteries that made up village life. But the great crisis had passed, leaving St. Mary Mead stronger for having faced it. The pattern of village life would continue, stitched together by countless acts of genuine kindness, occasionally torn by human failing, but always mended by human compassion. The elderly residents would stay warm this winter, and all winters to come, protected not just by the fund, but by the vigilance of a community that had learned the hard way that charity without oversight becomes cruelty, that desperation can drive good people to terrible acts, and that sometimes the greatest justice comes not from law, but from the transformation of guilt into service. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Miss Marple reflected one last time on the three who had contributed to Berkeley's death. James Cartwright, who'd weakened the harness with the same hands that had once served his country with honour. Agnes Pemberton, who'd possibly lit more than just a firecracker that night, who'd lit a fuse to long-suppressed rage. Robert Henley, who'd pushed a man to death with hands that had gently tended horses all his life. They would never fully escape what they'd done. In quiet moments, in the space between sleep and waking, they would remember. James would feel the leather parting under his knife. Agnes would smell the gunpowder and hear the horses scream. Robert would feel Berkeley's body giving way under his push, the moment when anger became action, and action became death. But they would also remember Mary Cartwright recovering in warmth that Berkeley would have denied her. They would think of Martha Hedges and Eleanor Henley, whose deaths had not been in vain. They would see the elderly residents of St. Mary Mead warm and cared for, and know that their crime had prevented greater crimes. It was not absolution, but it was purpose. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Not peace, but acceptance. And in a world where Thomas Berkeley's could flourish until desperate violence stopped them, perhaps that was the best that could be hoped for, that from the collision of greed and desperation might come wisdom, that from individual acts of violence might come collective acts of care, that from one man's death might come many lives saved. Miss Marple settled into bed, her mind finally quiet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the memorial bench, the empty stable, the village green where a man had died and a community had been reborn. By morning, everything would be covered in pristine white, as if the earth itself offered a clean slate. But beneath the snow, the earth remembered. The village remembered. And in that remembering lay both warning and hope. Warning against the corruption of charity, hope that even from the darkest winter of human nature, spring would eventually come. The pattern was complete, the final stitch placed. The story of the sleigh ride Sabotage would become village legend, told in hushed tones on winter nights, a reminder that when the cold threatens the vulnerable, when charity becomes cruelty, when the law fails those it should protect, human nature will find its own justice. Terrible, violent, but ultimately human. and Miss Marple, with her knitting and her keen understanding of that nature, would continue to watch over the patterns of village life, ensuring that the threads held strong against whatever storms might come, ready to spot the first sign of another pattern going wrong, another charity becoming corruption, another desperate soul approaching their breaking point. For that was her gift and her burden, to see clearly when others saw only surface, to understand the human heart in all its complexity, and to know that sometimes the difference between victim and villain, between justice and crime, was as thin as ice on a winter pond, ready to crack under the weight of human need. Thank you for joining me on Mindful Musings for this chilling tale of winter justice. The story of Thomas Berkeley reminds us that the coldest hearts aren't frozen by weather but by greed, and that sometimes the warmth of community can thaw even the deepest freeze, though the thawing itself may be violent and painful. The residents of St. Mary Mead learned that charity without oversight invites corruption, that desperation can transform the gentlest souls into instruments of rough justice, and that redemption often comes not through forgiveness but through service to those we've wronged or failed to protect. Until next time, dear listeners, stay warm, stay kind, and remember, in every pattern of deception, there's always one thread that, when pulled, unravels everything. But sometimes, what gets knitted afterward is stronger than what came before. This is William, wishing you mysteries that intrigue but never harm, and winters warmed by more than just coal, winters warmed by genuine community and carefully watched charity. Good night, and may your own patterns always hold true.